Let's make a game with GDevelop, the best no-code open source game engine that you can use on your desktop, web browser, or mobile devices. With GDevelop, you can make basically any 2D game that you can imagine, and even some in 3D. But in this video, we're going to be making a platformer game. The assets in this video are CC0, which means that they're entirely free to use with no strings attached. And we'll link to those assets in the description. Now, the first thing you need to do when making a project is create a new project. You can pick one of the template games and build off of one of those if you want to, but we're going to start from a new project. So we're going to click to create a project, pick our default size, give it a name, pick where you're going to save it, and then for this video we're going to be using pixel art, so we're going to select Optimize for Pixel Art. All this is going to do is change some of the default settings in the game project. And now we'll create the project. We start off with a blank scene with no objects, our starting game scene, and then our event sheet in the background. So the first thing we need to do for a platformer game is add our platformer character. So we'll click to create a new object. There are over a dozen different object types to pick from, but we're going to start with a sprite object for the character. We're going to click to import some images into this object. In this case, I already have them broken up into individual frames from the pack online. So we'll select the frames for the idle animation and add them in, and then change the time between frames to find something that's at a good pace. And we'll click here to make it loop. So this is the idle animation for the player. And we'll name that animation idle. Now the next thing we need to do to make it a platformer character is go to behaviors, add a behavior, and then select the platformer character behavior, which starts off at the top of the list. In here there are a bunch of settings for how fast the character moves and jumps, and whether or not they can grab onto ledges, or things like that. And lastly, we'll change the object's name to player, and press apply. Now we can drag this into the scene and you can see it's really tiny because this is pixel art to scale. So if I preview the game, you'll see the tiny character fall off the screen. The first thing we're going to do is go into the event sheet and click to add an event. The way the events work is really simple. On the left are conditions and on the right are actions. So if a condition is true, then an action will happen. So we'll start with the condition beginning of scene. So if it is the beginning of scene, something will happen. And in this case, we're going to set the camera to zoom in, and we're going to set it to 4 and base layer, so it will zoom in 4 times the initial scale on the base layer. And then we'll use another action to center the camera on the player at the beginning of the scene. So we'll use the action center the camera on an object and select the player object for the base layer. So now when the scene starts, we'll be zoomed in and the camera will start centered on the player. And then they'll fall off screen again. So now the next thing to do is set up the grid to be 16 by 16, and we'll add a tiled sprite object. And we'll start with a dirt platform. And this image is 16 by 16, so we'll set that as the default width and height, and rename the object as platform dirt. And then press apply. Then we can drag that platform into the scene, and here it is. Now, tiled sprites expand differently than regular sprite objects. A regular sprite object will grow in scale when you try to expand it, but a tiled sprite will actually repeat instead of stretching, which makes them great for building out levels and doing lots of different things with UI. If I double click on this, I'll open up the object and then I can go to behaviors and add the behavior platform and then press apply. Now, this is a platformer character, and this is a platform object. So if I press preview, now the character will land on the object. And because this has the platformer character behavior, I can use the arrow keys and spacebar to move it around and launch it off the platform. Obviously that movement is too fast, so I need to open up the player object, go to its behavior, and in the platformer object behavior, I need to adjust these values to find something that makes sense for this character at this scale. Now the next thing I'm going to do is build out the level. With GDevelop, you can use Tiled, a third-party tile editor, or LDTK, another third-party level editor, but for a level this size, it's actually easier to just use tiled sprites, like the platform we have here. So I'm going to add in more objects like this one, and then build out the level. When I have an object in scene already that I want to copy, I can just press Ctrl and drag it to create a new copy of that object. And because I duplicated these objects, instead of creating new ones from scratch, they came with the platform behavior already on them. So I don't need to add that for every single one. Next, I'll add a new kind of platform. And I'll call this one Bridge. What's different about this one is I'm going to go to the behaviors, and instead of it being a basic platform, or ladder, I'm going to select Jump Through Platform. So now this object, if I preview the game, can be walked through and jumped through, whereas the other ones are solid and can't be jumped through. So I can jump on the top of this one, and use the down key to go down below it. And now that we're building the level out a little more, we're going to want to make the camera follow the player. So we're going to go to the player object and add a new behavior. And this time we'll look for the smooth camera behavior, and we'll pick the one for the platformer character. Again, there are a bunch of values in here that you can change, but for now I'm going to just press apply. And now in the game scene, the camera smoothly follows the player around. Next we'll add one more kind of platform, and this will be one that can move. So we'll duplicate the bridge, and we'll call this Moving, for platform moving, and we'll change the image. This one's dimensions are 32 by 9, so we'll change this information, and put it here into the game. Now in behaviors again, we'll add a behavior for rectangular movement. And in this behavior we have two settings, for width and height. So if we change the height to 0, then it will be a straight line instead of a rectangle. And we can change how long it takes in each direction, but for now we'll just press apply. And so now if I go up to that platform, you'll see it moving back and forth and stopping for 1 second on either side of its range. And if the character jumps on the platform, it'll move back and forth with it. And there we go. Next we'll add some pickups to the game. So the only 2D object with animations is a sprite object. So I'm going to create a new sprite object and call it coin, and then import those images in. So I'll set it to loop and press preview to see the speed of this animation. And since it's a bit too fast, I'm going to slow it down. There we go. And now with that done, I can drag it into the scene, and with Control and the mouse, I can create a bunch of copies and put them into the scene. Now the next thing we're going to do is go to the event sheet and create a new event. And for this one, we're going to add the condition for collision with the player and the coin. So we're going to use the general object collision of the player with the coin object. So if the player runs into the coin, we'll use the action delete and we'll select the coin. So now, if we take the player object and run it into the coin will get deleted. It's a really simple mechanic. And now the next thing we're going to do is create an enemy for this character. So the first thing I'll do is make a spot for that. Where we're going to use these walls to check for collision to make the enemy walk back and forth. So for this one, I'm actually going to duplicate the player object because it has the platformer behavior, and we've already set up the movement speed to make sense with this scale. So instead of this idle animation, we're going to add in one for the walking enemy. We're going to select these images and delete them. And then we have the enemy's walk animation instead. So to prevent the player from being able to control this, we're going to go to the behavior and turn off default controls. So now the arrow key in space won't affect this object. And now I can put it into the scene. Before I preview the game though, I need to take away its smooth camera behavior because that will conflict with the player's smooth camera behavior. Now if I preview the game, you'll see that they fell down just like the player because they have the platformer object behavior. So now for the enemy, I'm going to add a new event and use the condition horizontally flipped. Because when the enemy runs into the ground in its path, we're going to use an action to flip the character so it'll go in the other direction. So we have one condition for is flipped, and then we'll invert this one as the condition for not flipped. So if the enemy is flipped, we'll use the platform behavior's controls to simulate left key pressed. So movement, platform behavior, platformer controls, simulate left key pressed. And then if it's not flipped, we'll do the opposite. We'll simulate the right key being pressed. And then finally, we'll go to the enemy object, edit points. So we're going to put a point on the object, add the point, and call it anything that we want to. In this case, I'm going to call it checker. And put it here in front of the character. As long as it's in front of the character and it will collide with the wall. So now that we have that point, we can create a new event and check if the point is inside of an object. And the object is going to be the platform stone, because that's what's on either side of the enemy. And then we need the expression enemy, so we'll select the enemy first, point X, because this is the X position and this is the Y position, along the grid. And then we'll put in quotation marks, and the autocomplete will show us the different points in that object. And since all there is checker, we can select that, and there we go. So this will check the X position of that new point that we made on the enemy. And then I can copy that down and change it to the Y point instead. So if that point is inside the stone, we will set it to flip the object. But now we need to do that again for the other direction. So if the enemy is horizontally flipped, and this point goes inside the stone platform, inside this, then we want to change it to the opposite. So if it is flipped, we're going to change it to no, not be flipped. And then if it's not flipped, we'll use the flip horizontally action and set it to yes to flip. So let's see that in action. If we go over to the enemy, we'll see it going back and forth way too fast, but it's working. There we go. And now that we have an enemy that walks back and forth, we need a way to die to it. Because otherwise it's not really a threat, but a decoration. So we'll go to the player object and include the animation for death. We'll set the duration, and this time we won't set it to loop. And then we'll go to the event sheet and create a new event. And we can just copy this event from above, where if the player is in collision with, but change the coin to the enemy object. We'll change the animation of the player based on its name to that death animation we just added. And then we'll create a new event and check if the animation is that death animation. Check the animation by name, select the player object, and if it's equal to death, then we'll use the action to deactivate the behavior of the player object and select the platformer object behavior and set it to no. So now when the player's animation is equal to death, we deactivate that behavior, and then we'll change the scene to the current one to reset the scene. So we'll use the action to change the scene and select the one that we're currently in. But if we left it like this, we wouldn't get to see the death animation play, because it would set the animation, making this condition true, and then immediately afterwards resetting the scene. So we'll use the action for wait X seconds, and we'll make it wait 2 seconds before resetting the scene. And to prevent this event from triggering multiple times, we'll use the condition trigger once. There we go. Now if I bring the player character over to the enemy and run into it, we die. And then 2 seconds later, the scene resets. Now let's do the same thing if we fall off the screen. So what we want to do here is set a boundary for the bottom of the screen. And the quickest way to do that is to just add an object and place it as the bottom of the screen. So we'll create a sprite object, call it boundary, and then we'll create one with Pascal. Pascal is the built-in image editing software in GDevelop that can be really handy for small tasks like this one. So we'll use the bucket tool and fill it with red, and then name the image boundary, and then save. And now we have a red square as the image for this object. Now place boundary into the scene and use it to mark the bottom of the level. Then I'll add a condition to check the Y position of the player object. So condition for Y position of the player object, if it is greater than, because the Y axis is inverted, so if the player falls beyond the boundary, the number will actually be greater than the boundary's position. So we'll use the boundary's Y position. And then we want this to happen for both of these. So I'm going to use the OR condition to check for either of these conditions. So now if the player is in collision with an enemy, or the Y position of the player is greater than the boundary, we change the animation to death. And then if the animation is death, we reset the scene. So now if the player goes below that, there we go. Although we don't actually want to see the boundary or the player stopping in midair when they fall. So we're going to set the camera to no longer go below that point. And we're going to do that by adding an event and using the action enforce camera boundaries. But since the only hard boundary is the bottom, which is this value here, we'll set this to boundary Y position. So the camera will stop at the top of the boundary. Then we'll use the player's position for the other values. So for the left bound, we'll use the player's X position, minus 1,000. For the right bound, we'll use the X position, plus 1,000. And then for the top boundary, we'll use the player's Y position, minus 1,000. Because again, minus is up and plus is down. So now the camera works properly in all directions except for down. And it will stop where that boundary is, hiding both the boundary and the player stopping in midair. The next thing you'd probably want to do is add text to your game. Now with GDevelop, there are 3 different types of text objects. The basic text object works well at higher resolutions with softer edges. But when you're working with pixel art, it renders blurry because of that same smoothing effect that makes it look nice at higher resolutions. So if you're adding text to a pixel art game, you want to use the bitmap text object. And for this, I've already created a bitmap font. There are lots of tools out there to do this, but I used snowbee.org. And once you get that, you'll get 2 files, one being the font file, and the other being the atlas image. And you can just add both of those in, and then drag your text into the scene. You can change the scale of that text in the object with the text scale option. And now we can use this text for lots of things in-game, whether it be in-game tutorials or on-screen UI to tell you how many coins you've picked up. So we'll set one of these to be the tutorial text, and we'll put text into the game. And then we'll duplicate that and make this the UI text. So since the camera is zoomed in 4 times for the UI, this is the actual size of the screen. So for the UI score, we'll need to change the scale to fit the size of the screen. And then to make this stick as UI on screen, we need to have it on a separate layer from the camera that's moving with the player. So we'll open up the Layers panel and add a new layer. Call it the UI layer. And then in the Properties panel, set that text object to be on the UI layer. So now all of this in-game is on the base layer, and the UI text is on the UI layer. So if you preview the game, you'll see that this text is in the game on the base layer, and this text is stuck to the screen on the UI layer. And now we need to make that score text actually do something. So we're going to make that count up as we pick up coins. So I'm going to right click on the screen and go to Scene Properties, and then go to Edit Scene Variables. From here, I'm going to add a variable. I'm going to set that variable to be a number variable and call it score. So now, in the event sheet, where the player runs into and picks up coins, we're going to add an action to make that score variable go up by 1 each time we do. So we're going to go change number variable for scene variable, pick that score variable that we just added, and change the modifier to add, and then 1 as the value. And press OK. Now, when the player collides with the coin, we delete that coin and add 1 to the score. But on top of that, we also want to change the text. So we'll select the UI score bitmap text object, select text to modify the text, and then we'll set that text to be the score, and then plus combines two things together, and then we'll type in score for the variable. So this is the variable score that we just set up. So it's the text score plus the variable, and press OK. So now we'll pick up the coin, delete the coin, change the variable, and then set the text to show that variable. And there we go. And now we want to animate the player. There are a bunch of different conditions and actions related to the platformer behavior, but it's faster to use the animator behavior for it. So if we go to the player object and go to behaviors, we can search animate, and we can find the platformer character animator, which is a behavior that flips the character and animates it as long as we follow the naming scheme in the behavior. So now I'll add 2 more animations to the character. One for jumping. Make sure to name that jump. And then one for running. And I'll set that one to loop. And then I'll press apply. Now, when I walk around, the animation changes to the run animation. And when I jump, the animation changes to the jump animation. Now you might have noticed that the character goes behind these objects in scene. And that's because every time you add an object to the scene in GDevelop, it adds 1 to the next object's Z value. So the higher your Z order is, the further ahead in the scene you are compared to other objects in the scene. So if I change this up and down, you can see the character going behind and in front of the objects. So if I just put that up to a higher number, and then preview the game, the character will no longer go behind those objects. Now the last thing to do is make the scene look a little prettier, and then add sound effects. So I'm going to add a series of tile sprite objects to use as the background. I'll set the Z order of these objects down to -10, just so they're definitely in the background. And then I'm going to add sound effects to the game. And all I need to do for that is use the action to play a sound. So when the player collides with the coin object, use the action play a sound, and then I can choose a file or create one with JFXR. JFXR is the sound creation tool built directly into GDevelop, and it's really useful for little sound effects to put throughout your game. But since the asset pack that we're using already comes with sound effects, I'm going to just pick one of those. Then I can set the volume and the pitch. Now whenever I pick up a coin, it plays a sound. And then every game wants to have some music, of course. So at the beginning of the scene, I'm going to set up music to play. So I'm going to use the action play a music file on a channel and pick the music that's in this asset pack. Again, setting the volume and the pitch, as well as the channel identifier that lets you pick which channel music is being played on. And of course we want the music to continue playing, so I'm going to select repeat the sound. Now, when the game starts, we have music and sound effects that get played when that character interacts with things. Now from here you can make any number of changes to the game to make it your own. Whether you want to add new enemies or any number of more complicated mechanics, the GDevelop YouTube channel is full of tutorials to help you do just that.